My name's Scott Blooney. I'm a senior principal at KDB, an intellectual property law firm with offices here in Massachusetts that focus on medical technologies. On behalf of KDB and Device Talks, I'm proud to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, Shacey Petrovic. Shacey is the president and CEO of Insulet Corporation, an innovative diabetes management company. Shacey joined Insulet in 2015 as its chief commercial officer, and she was elevated to her current position earlier this year. Previously, Shacey served in key roles in medtech companies, including as the president and CEO of Clinical Innovations and as a vice president at Hologic. Today, Shacey will discuss lessons learned from her career in the medical device industry and provide us with the latest news from Insulet. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Shacey Petrovic.
Hi, everybody. I hope you've had a really great day here at Device Talks. I'm so pleased to have you all here, and thank you for sticking with us for the full day. I'm personally really thrilled to have Shacey Petrovic as our closing keynote here in Boston. When the announcement came through that she was elevated to CEO, one of the first things I did was send her team an email, and I said, all right, how are we getting her to Device Talks? And here we are 6 months later.
My first keynote as CEO.
Her first keynote as CEO. Come on. We're excited about that. So Shacey, we got a little bit of your bio there, but I want to begin with your very first job in the medical device industry. What initially attracted you to this industry?
It's a good question. So funny because somebody asked me earlier, would I start with my first job, which was back windows girl at the car wash. But I'll fast forward 20 or so years to med device. I've been in the med device industry about 20 years, a little bit over than that. And I started as a pharmaceutical representative with Astra Merck, which no longer exists, so that's sort of dating myself. And spent the last couple of decades in leadership roles throughout med device companies. Scott mentioned some of them, but one private company and a few public companies. And I joined Insulet now about 5 years ago. I think, I came to Insulet specifically because of the mission of the company to improve the lives of people living with diabetes. My father has diabetes, and so I was personally connected to the disease. But I think for any of us, it's pretty easy to get connected to the mission in medical technology, regardless of where you are. And so that's what initially drew me to the industry in general. And I think has been kind of a personal connection specifically here at Insulet.
So you sort of mentioned a little bit about why you first joined the team at Insulet. Can you tell us a bit about that first week at Insulet, what that was like?
Sure. So I joined about 4.5 years ago, and the company was, I would say, in the midst of a turnaround, or maybe at the very outset, early innings of a turnaround. Pretty significant challenges in terms of product quality, in terms of inventory, capability building, et cetera. And I think the first week was eye-opening for me. What brought me there was this really elegant technology, truly differentiated. I could see, as somebody who had tried to convince her father to go on an insulin pump for many years unsuccessfully, I could see how Omnipod would be a game changer. But I don't think I fully appreciated the challenging reputation the company had when I first joined. And so that's where we really focused, is on sort of the fundamentals around the customer experience, product quality. And here we are, 4 years later, just closing out our third year of 20+% growth, really incredible strides made across that time. So.
Yeah, I mean, nobody can deny that's very tremendous growth for 4.5 to 5 years. So thinking about the state of diabetes management at large, there are a number of companies working to provide solutions that solve these issues that come up in diabetes management. I think, we've talked a lot today about how do you start with product development. One of the first steps is identifying that unmet clinical need. When you look at diabetes management, what is the unmet need? What remains the unmet need?
Well, diabetes is an epidemic. Just in the United States, there's almost 30 million people diagnosed with diabetes. So that's a lot of patients with a lot of different unmet needs. There's different patient segments, et cetera. But I think something common across all people living with diabetes and all families, because it's very much a family disease dealing with diabetes, is the need to reduce burden and to simplify life. If you just think about the cognitive burden of this disease, people with diabetes every day, they are navigating a myriad of challenges, just doing things that nobody else has to do because their pancreases do it for them. Estimating carbs, estimating the impact of exercise, estimating the impact of stress, estimating the impact of illness, of all of these different life circumstances to be able to then dose insulin, right? A drug that could kill you. People are individually responsible for dosing into their bodies. And so that pressure, that cognitive challenge is really enormous for people living with the disease. And I think, add to that then all of the challenges that come with accessing technologies. How easy is it for you to actually get the technology that you need, get the molecule or the insulin that you need? And so across the board, our mission as we see it, in improving lives is just to make these lives easier and simpler. And I think that is something that every single person living with diabetes can benefit from.
Yeah, so, I want to unpack a little bit about what you said there. You're talking about reducing burden. When you guys are thinking about product development and gaining access to the market, how do you wrap your head around burden that maybe isn't necessarily physically obvious? It's not like a measurement of a person's blood sugar. This could be something and the needs are so diverse, right? It could be something as simple as like, I'm exhausted at the end of the day because I'm not dosing properly and so I can't care for my kids or something like that, right? How do you, as a company, wrap your head around the ways that burden can infiltrate a person's life?
Right. There's been a lot of data actually looking at the psychosocial impact of diabetes. And specifically with Omnipod, we've even evaluated, the level of trust that a patient has in the device, because you can imagine the burden of wearing a technology that you don't trust. You're constantly anxious then, and we're adding to the cognitive burden as opposed to subtracting from it. So one thing we look at is the high level of trust that people have in the technology as an example. But it goes down to just fundamentally, who are we innovating for? How are we serving them? We're really thinking about how do we just make life easier? How do we take out the friction in these systems and the friction in the interaction with the customer to be able to kind of reduce that burden?
Yeah. It strikes me, if anyone in the room is unfamiliar with Omnipod, maybe you could tell us just briefly what the product is.
It's a good place to start. So our flagship product is the Omnipod insulin delivery system. It's a 3-day disposable, wearable insulin patch pump, and it delivers 3 days of nonstop insulin for people living with insulin-dependent diabetes. So the patient simply puts it on anywhere they would give themselves an injection, literally anywhere on their body, and it provides 3 days of insulin. It's controlled by a handheld remote control device that programs the insulin and delivers mealtime and basal insulin. And just very differentiated. So what a patient has sort of 3 choices out there when they need insulin. They can inject themselves 4 to 5 times a day with multiple daily injections. They can wear a traditional tubed insulin pump, which is a piece of capital equipment that carries insulin in it and is connected via about 40 inches of plastic tubing into your abdomen. Or you can wear Omnipod, which is this 3-day disposable patch pump.
So in the 5 years that you've been at Insulet, can you tell us a little bit about what sorts of iterations that product has gone through, the kind of evolution of the Omnipod?
Well, we're actually in the midst of our first new product launch in about 6 years. So most of the evolution for the product that has happened over the last 5 years, and it actually has been enormous, has been tied to what I like to refer to as life cycle engineering. How do we continue to make the product perform to the very best of its capabilities before we iterate on it? And so we worked around data management. How does the system connect into physician and patient data management systems to give a lot of good insight into how your glucose management is doing and how your insulin dosing is doing? And then we've also worked on simply making sure that the product performs better than any other system out there. So I think we have a very strong foundation now on which to develop, and just recently launched our most recent product, Omnipod Dash. And so that's the first real new iteration, and a pretty remarkable leap forward. What we've done with Dash is move it to a Bluetooth system, and we have turned the handheld controller, the personal diabetes manager, into a lockdown Android phone. So this device controls only the pod, but it is the first time that the FDA has approved a lockdown commercial phone as a part of a medical device system that delivers insulin. So a very exciting leap forward. Our vision is to be able to enable our users to control their pods via their cell phones. We know it's the number one request from our users, and Dash was step one, and next year we'll be right there at step two, which is phone control of your pod. So that's enormously exciting for our users.
Yeah. So speaking of your users, you have a unique name for your users, the Podders. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that these Podders play in designing and developing the iterations of these devices?
Yeah, so what's so exciting about that, and actually, I should have mentioned that on day one too, because what is unique about Insulet is that we are a medical device provider, a direct medical benefits provider. So when a patient is interested in using our technology, we do the benefits investigation, we deliver benefits, we actually ship the product directly to the patient, and we train the patient. So we have a lot of interaction with our patients. We're not just selling to a hospital or to a clinician and then sort of hearing about the end user experience. We are regularly experiencing the end user experience, and that is foundational to our culture. Everything really at the end of the day is relentlessly focused on our end user. And so that was very evident the first day that I arrived at Insulet. We have an incredibly engaged, passionate group of users, and they had self-branded themselves Podders. So it's not a name we came up with. It really is a name that was born of our customers. It was all over social media. They would hashtag Podders. And so we said, well, why are we using models in our advertising? We have incredible people who rely on this technology every day, who are incredibly passionate about it. Let's let them tell their stories. And so that was the rebranding of Omnipod that happened in 2016. Now every single person in all of our marketing materials on our websites, et cetera, are actually Omnipod users, and they've sort of self-branded Podders.
That is so cool. I didn't realize that was a self-branded term. I love that. So how many Podders are out there?
So what we've said publicly is more than 150,000 across the United States, parts of Europe and Canada primarily. And it's been growing really rapidly. The customer base has more than doubled in the last 3 to 4 years.
Ooh, love that kind of growth. So you guys just made a really enormous investment in Massachusetts. You just unveiled your new global headquarters, right, in Acton. I don't want to get the number incorrect. What was the number for the investment?
About $200 million.
$200 million investment right here in Massachusetts. We love that. Why here?
Well, I think, so the investment is an investment in our new worldwide headquarters and also in our first U.S. manufacturing line. And I think the worldwide headquarters is probably obvious, right? Massachusetts is number one in medical device exports, number two in device patents, number three in medical device employment. So there's a lot of talent and a lot of reason to be based in Massachusetts for our innovation and for our headquarters. Maybe what was less obvious was U.S. manufacturing. And I think that was much more of a debate and research for us as we headed into that decision. It's about 3 years in the making. And what has been remarkable is the advancements in highly automated manufacturing equipment. And there's a lot of sophisticated innovation that's happening around automation of manufacturing. And so our goal was threefold. We needed the capacity because we were growing so rapidly. We still do, but our first legacy manufacturing was in China. And so we didn't want to get out of China. We wanted to supplement China. We wanted the capacity. We needed the redundancy in the supply chain. And then our strategy is all about bringing new innovation to the market. And so we wanted to put our manufacturing close by our innovation teams so that we could get very good at technology transfer. And so we did look at some low-cost markets. We looked at other places in the United States, but ultimately settled on Massachusetts and acted in particular because we had an incredibly engaged and educated workforce, great technicians, not a lot of companies investing in manufacturing in Massachusetts. And so we had access to some terrific technical talent. And we are now, we all moved in January, so we're about 5 months into this effort, and it's been a tremendous success. So we are happily ensconced in the Acton community and benefiting from the tremendously talented workforce there.
Yeah, and I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here, but can you give us a sense of the number of jobs that maybe that facility added?
We created hundreds of jobs, and that will continue to grow. We are now, I think, about 1,000 people in Acton in total.
That's awesome. So as a leader in medtech, I think probably some folks in here are interested in your take on sort of the current events in the healthcare and medical device industry. I'm wondering, what sort of trends are you tuned into? What's the news that you're sort of looking for an update on?
I think there's probably two things. I mean, we have been monitoring and I think really getting excited about the sophistication and automation innovation that's happening on the manufacturing side. So we just spoke about that. I think the other area that for us is really top of mind and something that we are sort of developing around and listening to very carefully is this trend of consumerism in healthcare. You know, we have a product that is very much chosen by the consumer. And as we think about the intersection of consumer technologies like cell phones, like watches, like various types of cloud computing, along with medical technology, we see a tremendous opportunity to make good on our mission by reducing burden. You know, if we could fit these devices into the way that people are living today and the devices that they're already using today, we just see that as tremendously beneficial on a number of fronts, right? It certainly makes people's lives easier to rely on technology that they're already using. But it's also, if you think about handheld devices, you know, we make about 27 million pods a year. So it's an incredible volume. It's something that we have gotten incredibly good at. But the handheld devices, we make a lot fewer of those. And so if we can think about eliminating that and relying on a phone and a phone manufacturer who's making hundreds of millions of them, you can imagine the increased potential in terms of quality and in terms of performance, because it's what those people do very well. So that's, to us, really an exciting trend as we think about those things coming together. But it also means that we have to build new capabilities, right? We have to think about cybersecurity. We have to think about how do you actually do this in a safe and effective way for patients. How do we, for example, make sure that if a patient is using an app on their phone to dose insulin, that when they get a phone call or a text or a new operating system download, that it's still safe and effective. So those are, for us, a lot of the key questions that we are leading the way on. I think we're way out in front, but very well supported by the FDA in terms of ferreting out, these questions and making sure that we've got a good plan to have them answered when we're there next year, because we are going to be in the market next year with a phone-controlled Omnipod. Tremendously exciting, but lots of new capabilities, lots of new technology to be able to make that happen safely and effectively.
Yeah, so you're so perfectly anticipating my next question, which is, when you think about sort of short-term goals for the company, what can we expect to see from Insulet in 2020?
Well, 2020, it's interesting because I would have said, 2019, probably one of the most pivotal years for us. Really, just in this first quarter, we opened up our new U.S. manufacturing, new worldwide headquarters. We launched our first new product in Omnipod Dash in 6 years. We're about 6 months into direct operations in Europe. So a lot going on, tremendous expansion. And for me, 2020 is really exciting. Primarily, we'll see those things continue to add value. But what's really exciting is the launch of Omnipod Horizon. And this is probably in our pipeline and potentially in diabetes devices, the most anticipated innovation coming. And this is the Omnipod with a very sophisticated algorithm being able to take continuous glucose monitoring information from Dexcom and automate insulin delivery for patients. So this could be a huge reduction in burden. because today patients still have to really think about programming their insulin. And if we could do it automatically for them based on their glucose trends, we have the potential to do it more accurately with less human error and certainly less human intervention. So really reduce, again, that burden on the patients. And all of this from an app securely controlled on your Samsung Galaxy phone. So really exciting innovation coming in 2020 on our front that we think will sort of enable us to take our mission to the next level.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Horizon. It's these closed loop insulin delivery systems are so fascinating, and I know they're so wanted by the patient community. I know you read all online these like DIY people that are hacking together their own systems. I mean, it's a clear need from patients. Can you talk a little bit, I know this is a product that's still waiting to launch, so I'm not sure how much you can say, but can you talk a little bit about the challenges of developing those kinds of closed loop systems? Because, it's not just for diabetes. There are plenty of other therapeutic verticals that could do well with a closed loop system of monitoring and then delivering a drug based on a certain response. So I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about Insulet's experience developing a product like that.
Sure. I guess what I'd say is that ultimately simple is really, really hard. To get the customer experience such that these systems can be used reliably, because you're adding complexity. Today we are an insulin delivery system, and now in 2020 we're adding in a mobile app, we're adding in a sensor, and we're adding in an algorithm. So you're essentially adding in a lot of complexity to the system. And to keep the user experience simple and all of that happening in the background, that's hard. That's hard from a development standpoint. And what we've always said is we are developing for everybody. We are developing for the 2-year-old and for the 80-year-old. And we are developing for the multiple daily injection user, somebody who we call pump naive, who hasn't used these technologies before. And if you are developing for that broad base of users, it means that you have to work very, very hard to have a user interface that is intuitive, that people can pick up and use without a lot of training, without a lot of thought or cognitive burden. And you need it to be simple enough for a 2-year-old or for an 80-year-old. But you're adding all of this complexity into the system. So that is what comes down to good design work, having foundational technologies like Omnipod and like the Dexcom sensor that are very reliable. And it comes down to all the work, all the clinical work to refine the algorithm so that it can work across a broad population of patients, effectively and safely. And so we've been in clinical development for the system for about 3 years now. We expect to enter pivotal sometime later this year. And all of that work has been to look at multiple patient populations in real world living conditions, look at things like, intense exercise, look at things like high fat meals, different age groups, et cetera, so that we can really get a feel for how the system operates and sort of look at the edge cases so that by the time we get to pivotals and then into commercial use, the system has been very well tested across broad groups of people, and we can feel very confident in its reliable performance across, all those different patient populations.
Yeah, I don't envy the person whose job it was to design those clinical trials because they have to be really complex, I'm imagining. Big picture, 10 years out, how do you see the state of diabetes technology having evolved? What does it look like in 10 years?
I think we're going to see this, what is right now a nascent trend in consumerism, just get larger in diabetes technology. I think people will be dosing easily from their phones and from their watches and all of these things. I think you may see the systems become more interoperable. So this is a trend that the FDA has been encouraging around patients being able to select components of their system, their preferred insulin delivery system, their preferred sensor, their preferred insulin, maybe even their preferred algorithm, and sort of plug and play systems. And I certainly think that there's a mandate to make sure that all people have access to more technology to be able to manage their disease. Because it's one thing to be able to develop a great device. It's another thing to make sure that it is broadly available. And that comes down to cost effectiveness. That comes down to working very hard to demonstrate the clinical performance of the technologies as well. And that's an area where I think, frankly, diabetes devices has been a little bit behind. There hasn't been a lot of clinical data behind them. That's going to change because if you think about how these systems work, sensors are sensing information and then relying on a patient to do something about them. And that's the challenge in demonstrating good clinical outcomes because you're relying still on the individual to take the information and do something with it. Insulin delivery systems like Omnipod, we have the ability to deliver insulin, but we need perfect information to deliver insulin perfectly. And so many times the patient is just estimating carbs loosely and we're not getting great information. So that can be difficult then to prove outcomes. When you can pull these systems together and you've got information from a sensor that's very reliable and we can automate insulin delivery, we should be able to more completely and more compellingly demonstrate outcomes and should be able to broaden access for patients as a result of that.
I want to turn now to the audience. Do we have any questions for Shacey? Got a question right here.
So there is a warm-up period. It's subcutaneous measurement of glucose, and there is a warm-up period associated with all of the systems. They're getting shorter and shorter, so it's definitely an area where the sensor companies are working to advance. And then there's a lot of new sensing technology on the horizon that looks at multiple different measurements, different analytes, multiple sensors as an example of ways to reduce that warm-up period. I will say over time that warm-up period has gotten shorter for sensors over the last 5 years. And so, I think patients are actually encouraged by that. And so what would happen is the patient will spend those first 2 hours in open loop therapy while their sensor is warming up and then move into closed loop therapy. The other thing to note is that a sensor lasts for 14 days. So 2 hours for a 14-day performance, not a game, a showstopper. Yeah, a great point. And, it's why I always come back to access because we can all innovate. If patients ultimately don't have access to these technologies, it will hamper innovation. And certainly we won't get the benefit of the technology. I think we've seen the FDA be out in front of these issues. And I think now all of us, AdvaMed, many MDIC, many different advocacy groups are turning to CMS to try to look for solutions for ways to get these full systems reimbursed because there's a lot of cumbersome pathways today, as you know, not just around data and digital, but also, we experienced that at Insulet in terms of reimbursement for Omnipod because we had a disposable component and a durable component. And as a result of just that simple fact, CMS couldn't categorize us as either durable or disposable. And it took us 10 years to get medical reimbursement or Medicare reimbursement for beneficiaries. So those types of antiquated pathways are not helpful, especially at the pace of innovation that's happening today around digital. But I think we're seeing glimmers of CMS really trying to solve for this. I don't have any specific pathways today, but it's certainly an issue that's on the radar screen for device manufacturers as well as for CMS.
Great question. Anybody else got one for Shacey? Hi.
Yeah, we have a number of activities underway. We call that our drug delivery component of the business. Neulasta, I think, was a terrific proof source, essentially, of the power of the pod. We launched that program about 4 years ago with Amgen. It was actually start to finish probably a 6-year development program. Neulasta is a white blood cell rebuilder that's given to patients after chemotherapy. And the challenge that existed is that patients would go into the cancer center to get chemotherapy. And then Neulasta needs to be delivered at least 24 hours after chemo, or chemo will eat the Neulasta and it won't be effective. And so they were seeing a lot of drop off in patients because patients were going in to get their chemo, not feeling very good, going home, and then not coming back for the dose of Neulasta. Neulasta is proven to reduce post-chemotherapy infection by about 97%. So a pretty big loss when patients are not compliant. So we worked with Amgen to essentially put Neulasta into the pod so that the patient can go to the cancer center. Now, after their chemotherapy, Neulasta is put in the pod is applied to the patient, and 24 hours later, the pod wakes up and delivers the Neulasta. So we no longer have the fall off problem, and patients get the dose in the safety and comfort of their own home, which is a tremendous benefit, and I think a real big success. Now in the United States, more than 60% of the doses given of Neulasta are given via the pod. So that potential impact on compliance or adherence and outcomes and all of the benefits that come from that, I think, were really powerful and prompted a lot of interest in the use of the pod. The challenge that we have, and at Insulet, I call these champagne problems. We're growing at such a rate that we have to be really careful about where we spend our resources and time. And those development programs are a lot longer, for even commercially available molecules, could be about a 7 or 8 year development program. And we have less control over their success. Our partnership with Amgen was terrific. They've been tremendously successful. But for the most part, we have less control over the execution of that. So we're pretty picky, and we see it as a great long-term growth opportunity and diversification opportunity. But here we sit, about 2% penetrated into this huge unmet need of people living with diabetes and needing insulin, and a lot of wood to chop. We see a long runway in diabetes. So I think we'll see that diversification happen later on. There's a pipeline full of molecules, of large volume molecules that need delivery systems, and we'll let those kind of get through the development cycle. And then I think there's going to be a great application for Omnipod.
Any other questions for Shacey? Yes.
Yeah, I think, for most people, we haven't seen, the vast majority of people living with type 1 diabetes rely on insulin. I think what's interesting is this treatment pathway of people living with insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. And I don't necessarily look at it as a threat, but sort of an opportunity. I think, there is, you think about a disease that in the United States, 30 million people suffer from. There's a lot of opportunity for a lot of different technologies and a lot of different molecules to make a difference. So I don't view it necessarily as a threat. But I do think about that treatment pathway as an opportunity, because people living with type 2 diabetes, it's a progressive disease. Typically, they will fail lifestyle modification, then they will fail oral medication, and then they will move on to insulin. And so in the psychology of people living with type 2 diabetes, they view insulin as somewhat punitive. But in fact, many patients would benefit from getting to insulin faster. And many times they're on a whole host of expensive medications. And what actually gets them onto insulin is some tragedy, something like a lost toe or something like, or vision problems. And so our goal over time, we will see, we're continuing to gobble up share in type 1, but we have started to see a lot of people living with insulin-dependent type 2 use the product. And we think there's an opportunity to get people onto insulin more quickly with a simple-to-use system like Omnipod, so that you can reduce the cost of all of those medications and also hopefully improve outcomes. That's not for everyone, but certainly there are patients who would really benefit from getting on insulin sooner.
Well, Shacey, I want to thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have one more? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because when I first got into this industry, everybody was sort of saying the patient and the physician are becoming less powerful and the payer is becoming all powerful. And here we find ourselves now that social media has given everybody a platform in a much different world, right? Today, patients go second after their clinician, second to the internet and sometimes first to the internet for their, information on their treatment options. So I would say if you are not meeting patients in those areas where they're seeking that information, you are missing a huge opportunity. Digital chat rooms, Facebook, Twitter, there are patient groups on all of these avenues where people are seeking out and acting on information. So that's an obvious thing. I think the thing that we do really well, is engage patients in our development process. So we regularly have groups of users, Omnipod users or multiple daily injection users or competitive pump users into the office to weigh in on our user interface, to help us design our user interfaces, help us give feedback on marketing strategies, et cetera. But, these people, you said it, Sarah, right? There's a DIY community in diabetes who are making their own devices. They have learned a lot through that process, and patients are more than ever engaged. They're dealing with these devices 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for their entire lives. So shame on us if we are not engaging them in the development process and taking all of those learnings and factoring them into our development and, and really delivering better products as a result of it. So I would say engaging your users in the development process is probably the less obvious but really value add thing that companies can do.
Shacey, I want to say thank you so much we're so honored that we were your first CEO interview. I love that. Thanks so much for being here. Everyone, let's give a warm round of applause for Shacey.
Thanks, Sarah.